Thanks, Concorla. At December's meeting, the assembled ministers discussed migration. Yet again, the discussion, we're told, was based on a note circulated by President Tusk focused on, and I quote, preventing mass arrivals at external borders and tackling the root causes of the migration crisis. Now, in the short time I want to briefly discuss really two subjects that circle around the questions of asylum and migration. Two subjects which really often see a kind of a red mist descend over Western liberal eyes. And those two questions are the situation with Julian Assange and the situation in Syria. Now, since Julian Assange entered the Ecuadorian embassy in London 5 years ago and was granted asylum, the focus has drifted away from him and his rights under international law, and in its place what we have is a poisonous consensus in both the right-wing and indeed parts of left-wing media that he's in the embassy of his own free will, that he can walk away any time he likes, that the threat from the US government is overstated, and that really he is just a publicity-seeking narcissist. And we all know, sure, look at people who are not great, who have character flaws, don't deserve any human rights. Now, I want to state here that the media consensus on this issue is a complete distortion of the reality and an uncritical acceptance of what we can only call UK and US government propaganda. And I think in that context, with the spotlight off Assange's human rights, that it's up to us to turn back and look at that very issue and put it centre stage. In February 2016, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions, which falls under the United Nations Human Rights Council, ruled that Assange, after more than 5 years of effective imprisonment, had been deprived of his rights under international law and was the subject of arbitrary detention. The working group called for him to be allowed to exercise his right to freedom of movement and be offered compensation for his detention. The UK and Swedish governments responded to this by completely ignoring it, and actually by doing so ignored their obligations under international human rights law. Let's be clear and remember and look back when the same UN working group issued a decision in 2008 saying that Aung San Suu Kyi was being held in arbitrary detention. The UK government, along with the European counterparts, were quick to condemn it and order and call for her release. So we have to say universal human rights doesn't mean one law for people you like and one law for people that you don't. And we should be reminding our European counterparts of that. The working group's decision was 2 years ago, but the issue of Julian Assange's human rights has actually faded from public discussion in favour of tidbits about celebrity visitors and the involvement in publicising the DNC leaks. That there's little discussion of the basic fact that Assange is being arbitrarily detained by the UK in contravention of international law and his right to asylum, I have to say is all the more surprising, given that in April last year, CIA Director called WikiLeaks a hostile, non-state intelligence service, called Assange himself a demon who has no right to the First Amendment protections, and in the same month confirmed that the US has prepared a warrant for Assange and called his arrest a priority. So I think it's very, very worrying that the UK and US have manufactured this consensus around human rights and international law and indeed the right to asylum. So I'd like to ask the Minister that the next time we sit down with our European counterparts to make it known that Assange must be allowed to leave the embassy with cast-iron guarantees on his release that he can exercise his right to asylum in Ecuador without fearing extradition from an English prison to an American supermax. Now, I don't have much time to deal with the other aspects, but in terms of the root causes of migration, then obviously the situation in Syria is one of them. And I have to say the way in which this debate is represented here and indeed across Europe has been incredibly naive and simplistic, portrayed as the sort of debate between the good and the demand, that you have to take a side and only one side. And myself and Deputy Wallace were criticised for our visit to Syria and for our call where we based our support for an end to sanctions on our support for fundamental human rights and decades of evidence that sanctions hurt ordinary people far more than they do the regime. But somehow that was filtered through the Syrian distortion filter in some quarters as being support for Bashar al-Assad. And I think we have to say here, and I'd be hoping that the Irish government, when we go to Europe, portray the reality of Syria, of Syrian politics, of Syrian society, which is a kaleidoscope, not black and white. No society is black and white, and those of us who aren't part of Syrian society, to assume entrenched positions of what's happening there is actually profoundly wrong and short-sighted. All we can do is to listen to the people whose country it is, to be guided by them, to support them in their efforts. It's not for us to impose our will or our conception on what's right for them, and that's precisely the paternalism that drove 19th century imperialism, the same that drives Western interventions in sovereign states, which has led to 65 million people being driven out of their homes. If we really want to help the Syrian people, our only choice actually is to embrace nuance and avoid at all costs the temptation to assume ourselves the right to speak for and to represent them. And the very last point I'll make, Count Corla, in relation to that is the voice of a young Syrian youth activist who's implacably opposed to both Assad and ISIS, who puts forward a view that I think is the way forward. When he talks about those from outside deciding what's right, and he said they are interested in high politics, not grassroots struggles. They're dealing with grand ideologies and historical narratives, but they don't see the people. The Syrian people aren't represented. They're holding on to depopulated discourses that don't represent human struggle. We are a people, not a tool for the narratives of the Western media. This is our country. We are not guests.